All right, welcome back to Tapped In. This is episode 7. 6, 7. I'm Anna Summersett here with...
the very annoyed by 6'7" Benson Varghese.
You can tell we have kids. They say it a lot.
They do.
So in episode 7, we're going to be talking about a very popular end of the year conversation, which is centered around compensation. Compensation meaning, how you value your team culture, how you are bonusing, how you are planning out the predictability financially of your firm for the next year, all of those big conversations.
Yeah, I would say that.
Oh, yeah, you go ahead.
Compensation.
You've got a lot of big feelings on this.
Is not just a person's salary. It is the choice that you make, perhaps by practice area, on the total compensation package, which could and likely should include something more than a base salary. And that could be you have financially incentivized KPIs. It could be bonuses. It all has to be customized to what your firm needs it to be to attract the talent pool that you're looking to attract, to retain the talent you're looking to attract and retain, to compensate them adequately, to motivate them adequately. So you, I think, have to start with, what are you trying to accomplish? And you've got these different mechanisms to do that. And I don't think there's any one right answer, even for a practice area. It's very much a question of, what are you trying to accomplish for your firm and how do you get there?
Well, and we'll get to the different types of compensation models that law firms engage in a little bit. But what you started with is something that I think is really important to understand when you're having this conversation with your partners or with your staff, which is compensation says a lot about who you are as a firm and what you value. Right. And so when you're choosing a compensation model, whether it's a lockstep or it's an eat what you kill model or a hybrid of the two that encompasses all different things, I think you have to consider, what type of firm you're aiming to have and how you want your people to feel and what type of work-life balance do you want them to have, in addition to kind of the logistical operational aspects of it, which are, what type of practice area are you in? What type of municipality or metro area are you in? What's your marketplace look like? What does your hold on the marketplace look like? And those are all kind of big bucket concepts. But let's start with your first question, which is really, what type of law firm do you want? And when you're thinking through your compensation modeling and how you structured it, what are the first things that came to your mind about the firm you're trying to build?
Well, for our firm, it's always been about attracting the best talent, and that has a lot of facets to it. One is objectively, what is this person capable of accomplishing given the right resources? But the other part of it is sometimes the intangibles of, is this the type of person we want representing our firm, not only to clients, but to fellow members of the bar, right? If you have a team where others start asking, how do you get a job there? The environment seems amazing. The team seems amazing. Often those intangibles are overlooked, but those are things you need to be thinking about in terms of, what do you want your firm to look like? And it also has to do with, what is the model you're running? Are you trying to run a volume practice? Are you trying to run a practice where you're giving white glove service, which is what we aspire for? So to directly answer your question, I'm looking for the best of the best. And I'm asking myself, what will it take to get them here and keep them here?
Well, and you mentioned always trying to attract top talent and wanting the best of the best. Does that mean only in the practice of law, or does it consider other areas where they can have significant impact, whether it's client relationship, client service, inner office culture, academia, things of this nature? Do you consider those when you're kind of defining what the best lawyer is and who you're looking for?
Yes, we look at as many aspects about the person as we can. And it's not just for lawyers. We have the same, call it admonishments or guidelines or expectations for interns as we do lawyers. You're going to treat people well. The bailiffs at the courthouse are going to brag about you as much as hopefully the judges have positive things to say about you. So we're looking for the right people who reflect those values.
Well, and I think, when you talk about a model that pushes your goals forward. So finding top talent, recruiting them and retaining them would be yours, right? Do you also consider compensation models that, you know, put away or disadvantage the things that you don't want to happen, like whether it's inner office competitiveness, whether it's stifling innovation? Like, how do you consider the negative impact that a compensation model could have?
One of the things I try to instill with our team is you are your only competition. In other words, just because I have two people with the same title, I may not be evaluating them the same or compensating them the same. Let's take two case managers, for example. If one case manager comes to me and during the hiring process, we understand the most valuable thing for them is to have a healthy balance between time at work and time at home. Perhaps they have young children that they need to be flexible for. Their compensation model might be different than someone who comes to me and says, I'm at a stage in my life where I want to make the most I can possibly make, and I want to provide the greatest value I can to the firm. I have the time and energy to do that. And so each person in that example might have the same title, but very different metrics. And as a law firm owner, you have to open yourself up to it may not be a one-size-fits-all model for everyone. Even within divisions, we've seen there are different models that work for different people. There are different models that work to attract different types of talent, right? If you have a very senior attorney that you're trying to bring into the firm, you've got to incentivize them perhaps a lot more than you would have to incentivize a first-year associate right out of law school. So those are all things that we take into consideration.
Well, and, as we're thinking about what people are hoping to gain out of this conversation, right? Which may not be the complexities of like our bonus structure, our compensation model, because I would say administratively, it's very difficult because we do really customize and tailor our compensation modeling to each individual person. So I want to talk about it kind of from an aerial view of the different types of compensation, kind of the pros and cons of the compensation models, ultimately why we didn't choose or why we did choose a specific compensation model. So let's talk first about lockstep compensation, which I think, despite its name, which threw me the first time I read it, it's probably the one that most law firms grew up having, right? So like the firm of 20 years ago, the firm of 30 years ago, were more likely to be on this compensation model, which is essentially a scheduled raise model. Like associates make this amount, 5-year associates make this amount. If you become a partner, you make this amount. And the idea is that it's very consistent. It's very risk averse, from a financial planning standpoint, you know what you're getting yourself into. But on the flip of that, there's very little individual compensation modeling for bonus structures, incentives, things of that nature. So talk to us a little bit about kind of the pros of lockstep compensation models, the cons of that compensation model, and ultimately what you thought about it.
At scale, the only place I can think of where, let's call it a firm, is using what you're describing as a lockstep model is when I think back to the DA's office, which operates as a law firm. We had some attorneys who were in what were called career paths. And a career path attorney followed this model where they would know if I'm here for 4 years, my salary will be X. And if I'm here for 5, it'll be Y. And there is a natural, pre-established policy for how their salaries would go up over time. The reason I don't see something as simple as that in private practice is perhaps there's really not an incentive for good work or being highly productive, right? You just know it's stable. That's an advantage. And for the organization, there's the advantage of, well, now all I need to know is how many people do I have and how long has each person been here? And that will tell me exactly what my salary will be for next year. Great. It helps you plan and arguably grow in a much more predictable fashion. But because it doesn't really reward what we on the private side of the bar need, which is high producers, at least to some extent, I don't necessarily see that model being used widely, at least on its own.
Well, and you mentioned the district attorney's office as an example of this compensation structure. And I would agree because The lockstep compensation model really only seems to work when there is a uniform contribution, right? So there's an expectation that everybody performs about the same, everybody works about the same, everybody's caseload is about the same, we have fixed expenses. And the idea on the flip of that is everybody's fungible, right? If you become a top performer, if you're putting in all of the hours, if you're making all of the money on the private side for your firm and you're not being compensated disproportionately for that, you're going to immediately look for other places to land, right? That's just common sense. And so there's no incentive for your rainmakers, which demotivates them and causes them to leave. But in some practice areas, that's okay. Like the idea is if you're in a volume practice, you don't have a specific area of expertise. You're not operating at a very high level in terms of the practice of law because it's basically paper pushing, then this model could work, right? Because it does encourage teamwork and, everybody getting along because everybody's on the same level, making about the same much. You know what you're getting yourself into, provides that stability. It's very risk averse. And so I think if you're in private practice and wanting to have these kind of curve buster years, if you will, where you've got these really high performing individuals bringing in a lot of revenue that can be reinvested into firm growth, this model's just not for you.
Great.
Is that ultimately why you didn't choose it?
We certainly wanted to reward people proportionate to their work. And for the folks who were not necessarily brought in because they were high performers, we were creating a pathway that made sense for them and what they were bringing to the table. The only time I would even consider it in private practice is if I had a workforce that was just so caught up in the infighting and the battles between what one person is making versus the other, then perhaps there's an argument that, look, if you're in this role, you know what you're going to make based on how many years you've been here. And it eliminates that friction perhaps. But again, we focus so much on being drama-free from the beginning. It's okay if people talk about their compensation and it happens to be different because they understand you're bringing different things to the table. You've come to us and asked for different things, and we've made something that works for you.
Well, and as long as we're talking about infighting, we'll talk about the next compensation model, which can create a lot of competition, inside of a workplace, which is the eat what you kill model, which is essentially whatever revenue you generate, whether it be through clients that come in the door because they were referred to you through your networking, whether it be the amount of cases that you've worked on and the revenue that those cases have generated, that you get a straight percentage of that, whatever that may be. It doesn't include a base compensation modeling. There is no stability in terms of a salary you get to fall back on and rely on. But it can ultimately end up in a very high compensation model for the staff member if they are a high producer or a high earner. I think that one of the things we had talked about with the eat what you kill model, which I think does to a certain extent have a place in modern law firms, was this competitive nature, people hoarding clients or hoarding network opportunities or marketing opportunities. So talk to me a little bit about what do you think about the eat what you kill model?
Eat what you kill has a fundamental fairness aspect to it, which is you are being rewarded based on the work that you put in. And again, the work could be both on the attribution side, you brought the case in or helped bring the case in, or actually working up the case. The problem with eat what you kill is it's really impossible to scale. I've seen it work with a couple of lawyers. I've even seen it work with 4 lawyers where they've basically shared some expenses and there was a natural hierarchy to how the cases were allocated. Once you start growing beyond that, though, who gets what case is a massive problem. Imagine having 6 attorneys, a call comes in, who gets that call? Because if it's eat what you kill, we all want that case. And so if you say, well, you're going to get every 6th call, and the 6th call happens to be a 6 or 7 or 8 figure case, and the call that I got was a 5-figure case, it's not going to work out long term. So it's not the lack of reward that's the problem when it comes to eat what you kill. It's the fact that you're going to have massive problems with who gets what case. When you're talking about a smaller group, and where I've seen it work is, let's say you have 1 or 2 seasoned attorneys, and the younger attorneys that join them know, hey, I may be getting the scraps that fall off their table, but I'm at a point in my career where that's what I want. I want to learn, and I want to learn under really great attorneys who are going to show me the way. So there's a place for that, and it's a viable model. You just have to understand it's not necessarily a scalable model.
Well, I think, on the pro side, if you look at it not in the sense of how it rewards or incentivizes your high producers, there's also really no place for low performers to hide. I think when you look at a lockstep model, it's pretty easy to get by as an underperformer, right? Everybody's making the same. There's no incentive to perform at a high level. Everyone can just kind of skate by and, be kind to each other in teamwork. But on an eat what you kill model, if you're not producing, you're literally not eating. And it's a great model for hunters. Like, don't get me wrong, but really not so much for farmers. And I think one of the things we've learned about a firm is that it really takes all kinds, right? You can't have a firm filled with hunters. You'd only be eating meat, which isn't healthy for anybody. It really does take rounding out your team with all different types of players to make it work and to make sure that everybody's rowing in the same direction. But I think in some areas where it could work are either like with small firms, like you talked about, a couple of partners may make sense, people who are sharing expenses. But I think for even mid-sized firms who have kind of siloed practice areas, it can work. If your practice areas aren't competing with each other, like if you're doing divorces and this guy over here is doing estate planning and this person over here is doing collaborative divorce and this person over here is doing DWIs, when the call comes in, it's pretty clear as to who it goes to. They have these siloed practice areas. There's not going to be competition over those clients. I think where it creates a bigger problem is when you have a larger firm or when your practice areas require a sense of cross-marketing, because then it's a question of, well, that person initially called for this and I handled their case, and now I'm going to be referring it over to this practice area and they're going to work on it and make revenue and I want to cut of that too. So it doesn't really necessarily encourage this idea of what can I do that's best for the firm? It's really what can I do that's best for me, which if you're a business owner trying to grow and scale the firm is a problem. So, I think the other aspect of it, and we've talked about this before, is succession planning, right? Which is what happens one day when you are not here. Let's not say you're not on the earth somewhere, but like maybe you want to retire, one day. Maybe, your kids get older and get married and move halfway across the country and you just can't stand it. And so, you move and maybe some tragedy befalls and things change in terms of the leadership structure of the firm. I think an eat what you kill model is near impossible to have succession planning, right? Because when everybody's out for themselves, nobody's going to take the position of management, of director, anything involving operations, leadership over people, because what's in it for them, right? And I think the high performers will continuously ask themselves in that model, why don't I just go out and do this on my own? Right? Why am I sharing a cut of this with somebody else? Which I think the honest answer to that is because they want to be lawyers, not business people. And those are dramatically different skill sets, which I think is a really great value that especially mid-size firms can offer high talent or high-performing talent is we'll handle all the business side. You just come in and be a lawyer. And we'll give you a cut, right? And what does that look like? But it's tough because you want the incentive to be high enough for these kind of hunters, these killers, to feel compensated well enough and happy enough with the support administratively that they're getting, that they don't want to go out and do it on their own. They want to do it with you. So the last compensation model, which we'll just call a hybrid, which is kind of like a points-based system, is really just a combination of what I would consider are the pros of both of those, of lockstep and of eat what you kill. So it's basically this idea that there's a portion of compensation that has to do with how long you've been at the firm, how experienced you are as an attorney, how many years you've been in the same practice area, and then also a portion of that compensation modeling that has to do with incentivizing performance. So whether that's revenue-based, work-based, culture-based, I think there's different ways you can compensate. So talk to us a little bit about what do you think the pros and cons of the hybrid system is?
Well, the hybrid model gives you the opportunity to really customize how people are compensated, take a holistic view of what they're looking for, but also what they bring to the table. So when you look at what they bring to the table, you have both producers and non-producers, right? Some people you look at, they're an attorney, they have an hourly model, or they have a contingency fee. There's some way they're bringing in revenue to the firm. But then you have other parts of the firm where the person is not directly bringing in revenue, but they're a necessary part of the firm. Everyone from your receptionist to the folks that you have in intake, pick anyone who is not directly revenue producing, they're by definition non-producers. So you're thinking about, how do I compensate people so that they, one, have security, right? Anyone under this hybrid model has the opportunity to, at a base level, take home what they need to live on, and potentially, based on whether they're a producer or non-producer, have an incentive model where they could really bonus well, right? For the non-producers, they may be tied to key performance indicators, KPIs, where you're tracking things like time on desk, how many demands did you get out? Pick any metric that makes sense, that moves the needle for the firm, that's of value to the firm. For producers, sometimes it's easier to look at, well, how much revenue did this person bring in? Or how many cases can we attribute to this person? They may not have handled the case, but they helped get that phone call that ultimately became a case. Those are all things that you can work out metrics to reward people for. And so you are offering people stability through this model. You're giving them the opportunity to be compensated based on what they bring to the firm. The downsides are, there are some inherent pieces of this that are unpredictable, right? I might come to you and say, hey, Anna, I'd love to work here. I'm okay with the lower base pay because you're going to give me a much higher commission on the work that I do, because I have an expectation of myself that I'm either going to bring in cases or handle a very heavy caseload. Well, let's say 3 months into the year, something happens to me and I'm unable to work at my normal performance level for an extended period of time. Well, now I, as the employee, am going to take home much less than I may have projected for the year.
Well, let's hope it's not a workers' compensation issue.
There you
Nobody
go.
fell on the job,
That's
literally.
right. That's right. But there is some risk inherent to that.
Sure.
But there's,
well, and for the firm too. I mean, you're providing a compensation model based upon what you believe is a steady stream of incoming cases. Let's say marketing changes, the marketplace changes, the number of intake calls you get changes. Now you can't fill those caseloads the way you would in order to even have billable hours that are available, to people who are relying upon that compensation model. But I think what you hit on is interesting in terms of one of the cons of the hybrid model, which is it's incredibly complex, right? I mean, so far you've talked about key performance indicators. You've talked about different types of compensation modeling. So whether it's revenue-based, whether it's referral-based, you've talked about throwing that plan up against the potential stressors that can come to a law firm, which can be, COVID, right? How that changed the marketplace for everything. It can be you lose a rainmaker, right? And now your revenue's cut by 10%. It could be there's a leadership change. So you have all these stressors that can dramatically impact that compensation model. So talk to us a little bit about the complexity of a hybrid model and how, even to its detriment, you can really get into the weeds on how you play this out.
It's an infinite number of permutations. You pick any model. You could have discussions about, are you going to reward people based on what they build versus what they collected on those build hours? You can have conversations about how much risk is a person willing to take and how much risk is the firm willing to take to come up with a number that makes sense as your base salary. As you try to come up with key performance indicators that do two things, really move the needle for the firm and properly incentivize the person, it's almost a tertiary question of, well, how are you going to track that information? Is it easy to track? And even being on top of tech and having the ability to customize the tools that we build to track all of these things in our firm, it is a lot to track. And the more you grow and the more flexible you are in coming up with these compensation models, the harder it becomes to track all of those things. And ideally, you want to automate as much of the tracking as possible so that your systems are something that you go look at as opposed to having to manually check or update. But that is definitely a downside. And if you do it wrong, the upside of incentivizing people can be completely negated by the amount of time that it takes to track those KPIs. And the very first time we rolled out key performance indicators,
nightmare.
It was terrible. And we realized the amount we were bonusing people was not enough to spend the countless hours, right? If the delta between low performance and high performance is $2,500, but I'm spending 30 hours to figure out if you get $2,500, I'd rather pay you the $2,500 and call it a raise and be done. Right. But then I've gotten rid of how am I helping you perform in the way
that and holding people accountable.
Right. For sure. So it's a dance.
Yeah. And I think what's also interesting too is like, you know, when some people are testing out, and you just mentioned KPIs, for example, you test out a new concept, you roll it out. It's disaster in terms of organization, which was kind of the impetus to a certain extent of creating Lawft. Was we didn't feel like we had a robust enough reporting system to track the KPIs we wanted to track acquisition, to track return on investment on certain things. And so, you know, we built that into the CRM, you know, with Lawft, the things that we felt like were really, really important. But what's interesting about having a compensation structure that you didn't think out entirely when you did it, or it didn't turn out in a result base the way that you wanted, good luck redoing that the next year. Because what ends up happening is people feel shorted, right? If they didn't make next year what they made the year before, they're like, what am I doing?
Right.
Why would I do that? I'm like, well, your performance may have looked very different last year than it looked this year, right? Which is, you know, partially under your control. It could be partially under the firm's control in terms of how many cases are you feeding in? What type of marketing efforts are you doing? Like, I think if our firm just stopped all marketing efforts, you know, we just decided to hoard that money instead of spend it, what would that do to the leads that are coming in? And how would that affect down the line the compensation of the team? But there's a lot of things to consider. And you want to make sure that if you're going to roll something out, you've really thought through those stressors before you do it, because going backwards is very difficult.
Agreed. And, you know, if you're replacing KPIs with something else, for the employee at the end of the day, they're absolutely asking that question. I worked this hard this year and I got X. If I work the same amount next year, I better not make less than X, right? So you do have to be careful about what you're rolling out and when. Also understanding that things change. The more you grow, sometimes the more expensive your firm becomes, right? What you have to spend to get in the sufficient number of cases to feed 100 people is very different than if you only have 10. Right. So
and even year over year, it could be more expensive to run the same team.
Absolutely.
Right. I mean, like, count inflation on its own, much less like how much more competitive a specific marketplace can become, especially in a certain practice area. As a city grows, I'll use Fort Worth as an example. Fort Worth, you know, 15 years ago was a very different city than it is now. And that city's been really, really good to our firm. And we have grown with it. But it has become exponentially more competitive, right, over the course of that time. It is more expensive now to make the same amount of money than it used to be. So your margins look different. So you have to figure out where to adjust and kind of where the relief valves are to incentivize properly, but also make sure that you are really fiercely protecting that profit margin, because ultimately that is what protects the firm and all the people in it.
When you look at what your team needs to make themselves, you're recognizing cost of living has gone up. Everything has gone up astronomically. So if your idea is just keeping up with cost of living, even that is going to cost you more over time. And so you're trying to come up with models that take that into account, but are also holistically giving your firm enough profit that you can sustain yourself, right? And it's not just about in the months that everything's going well, but you have to anticipate there will be some months that things don't go well and you may not be profitable. And unless you plan on laying people off, you have a commitment you've made to them that you're going to keep paying their checks. And through the pandemic, through the 11 years we've been in business, we've never laid anyone off. We've never skipped a paycheck. Although in the early years, we've skipped our own.
Well, we've never laid anyone off, I guess, in the sense of we can't afford you, we have to let you go. Right. That is absolutely true. People have been fired, just to be clear.
Yes. But not because we couldn't pay their check.
Right.
And so that's, that's what you have to think about is it's not just this year. It's not just this month. And particularly in PI, you feel like you just won a big case. I'm good for the next 6 months. Well, you're not thinking about the next 6 months. You're thinking about the next 5 years because we really value retention at our firm. And we're not looking for what's going to take care of the next 6 months. We're making commitments to people that hopefully they grow with us and they stay with us for as long as possible.
I had a really interesting conversation with a personal injury firm outside of Texas recently who was talking about their profit modeling with their partners and how they essentially try to take out the maximum amount of profit they can every distribution cycle. And I was like, well, how much, like on a percentage basis, do you make sure that you're investing back into the firm, right? To really future-proof your firm, to invest in new technology and new software and new CRM, to invest in onboarding, somebody involved in AI who can really build out your systems and automations, like to invest in the continuing education of your team. Like, what's your percentage for setting aside? And they're like, we don't do that. And it just blew my mind. I was like, what do you mean? They're like, well, we have savings in case we have a bad month. I was like, so you're just taking it home? They're like, yeah, because if we leave it in the firm, we're going to spend it.
Yeah.
And my mindset is totally different. Like my mindset is leave it in the firm so that you can invest it back in the people who got you to where you are, right? I want this team to grow. I want them to grow with us. I want them to make more next year and in 5 years and in 10 years. I want them to be better at what they do. I want the firm to be branded in a way that everybody understands how excellent people are here. And like, those are the things that are really important to me. If I were to take it home, who knows what I would spend it on, but I would turn around in 6 months and a year and be looking at the same firm I had last year, which is not growing and dying.
Yeah, we've talked to a lot of law firm owners who fund their firms essentially through lines of credit. And they do take home as much as they can possibly take home. And that's never been our model. We've been blessed to be able to operate on cash, building out all our offices, all the things, because we don't want to ever get into a position where, again, it depends on the bank as to whether or not we can run payroll, right? We are always thinking about what can we do to reinvest in the firm. And that means both in terms of technology, growth, people, offices, but it also means being financially responsible so that we can make it through those lean times.
Yeah. Well, and I'll talk a little bit about the cons, I think, of the hybrid model, which is really, unless leadership is willing to confront underperformers and willing to hold accountable, right, people to their expectations, the expectations they've clearly set. It's a very difficult model to make financially profitable. Because you are compensating performance so well, but you're providing a base still. And some people may just sit back and rest and not feel like they need to perform. And I think sometimes, especially with modern law firms, there's a less of a likelihood that people are willing to have the difficult conversation. And especially when we like someone and we think that they're a really good culture fit and they're a good person, but they're just not performing. And we've had clear conversations about setting expectations. It's taking that next step of holding people accountable to that, right? And understanding that while you may treat your colleagues as some of your best friends and some would even say family, it's still a business. And by allowing the interests of one or two or a small group of people to override the interest of everyone at the firm puts the entire thing in jeopardy. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you hold people accountable to this structure and kind of what your set expectations are?
So now I think more than ever, you have to hold people accountable. There was a national publication recently that wrote an article about job hugging, which is, according to them, a new phenomenon where people who are not happy with their jobs will stay at that job because they know it's a paycheck. They don't want to risk going out and finding a new job. And so they'll just stay there. They'll hug their job until they're forced to quit. And that's really a problem when you start talking about people who have a high base pay, right? If there's not much of an incentive to perform, or they can live with their base pay, right? Even if there's a huge incentive to perform, but they're very happy with their base pay, it's easy to coast and either hope they won't get noticed or to coast as long as possible. Within our firm, the way we're structured, we have division leads who are in charge of their divisions. And our expectation is certainly the division leads are not only keeping an eye on whatever the appropriate metrics are, but also talking to the line employees to say, hey, we're a little off on our metrics. Maybe we need to be looking at this more frequently. And as we look at it more frequently, we're either correcting or we're unable to correct. If they're unable to correct, then the obvious question is that something within their control or is it something outside of their control? If they're not producing because I haven't gotten them the cases they need, that's on me and I need to make adjustments. Mm-hmm. If, on the other hand, we've given them the opportunity and they're not taking the cases, for example, or they're not working up the cases that they have, cases are sitting on their desk for too long, then we have identified a problem, we've talked to them about it, and the accountability portion of it means you have to cut ties, right? Because this model does not work unless you're willing to do that. It's also disincentivizing anyone who's working hard, right? So you think about your A players, they see a C player sitting around coasting, and I can't imagine anything being more disillusioning. Why am I working hard if that guy gets to sit over there, take home perhaps more than I'm making or as much as I'm making and really not work for it?
Well, but that's kind of like what I love about the hybrid model is if you've got a high performer, ideally, if the model's set up correctly, they are compensated for that work and compensated significantly more than your underperformers. But it does raise the question of, if you talk about firms that will cut their bottom 10% every year, just cold, just out, you're gone, your bottom 10%, and replace it. Are they replacing it with people who are at a mid-tier or higher level, right? Or are you just continuously replacing the bottom 10%? But I think that what's interesting about the hybrid model, and you talked a little bit about this, is that when it fails, it's usually not by design, it's usually by execution, which is just how their leadership is willing to or not willing to hold people accountable to the modeling, right, and to the structure. And I think this is an important part to mention again, that there are different ways that members of a firm bring value to the bottom line. And it doesn't have to be only in revenue or in billable hours. It can be reputation. It can be branding. It can be experience, subject matter, expertise. I was actually talking to a law firm. We were sitting down at lunch recently, and there were two other PI firms there. And one was in a hyper niche, very specific, only 20 law firms in the country practice in this area. And the other was a pretty standard PI practice, motor vehicle accidents, trucking accidents, sexual assaults. And they were having a compensation structure conversation. And the bonuses for law firm A that has the super niche practice area was 25% of everything that they handled, they got. And law firm B is over here, his mind is like blowing up. He just cannot comprehend, paying 25%. And his bonus modeling is 4%. It's dramatically different bonus compensation. But you have to consider law firm A is dealing with, maybe they have 6 of only 100 lawyers in the entire country that practice in this area, right? And what do you have to do to maintain and retain those people at your firm? Whereas law firm B, how many PI lawyers are there?
Yep.
And I'm not saying they're all great, but there's certainly more to choose from.
It goes back to the very beginning of this conversation where you commented on how prosecutors could be seen as fungible, right? The more people that are available to do your job and the more replaceable you are, the easier it is to compensate everyone exactly the same. But if you have people who have unique talents who cannot be replaced, then yes, they get to decide how much they get paid.
Yeah, I think with the hybrid modeling is the idea that most people want a choice or a say in their compensation. Some people want a work-life balance. Some people want to grind. And there are some people kind of in between. And while we want teamwork, we also want people to own their careers and really identify with what they're asking for, right? And your compensation should mirror what you want your career path to look like. So while there's a lot of considerations, a lot of complexities to the hybrid model, and executing it, correctly is really going to determine whether it works or not. I think there's a lot of reasons why we chose it, for our firm and why I think it works.
Absolutely.
So just to kind of wrap up, and I know we've talked a little bit about the different models and how you can consider compensation, but I wanted to talk a little bit about it and as it pertains to firm citizenship, which is basically training of associates, knowledge sharing, leadership roles. How do you account for the kind of the time suck that's necessary to train and mentor? And what weight do you give that when evaluating somebody's compensation?
Well, at our firm, one of our core values is having a growth mindset. So at some level, it is expected that you are not only going to try to grow yourself, but you're also going to be pouring into others. So that's part of the expectation. But it also matters when people are asking us for promotions, right? So if you came in and you started as a line employee, but now you're interested in moving up to a senior position, there are a number of things we look at to see if you're even qualified to have that conversation. And certainly one of them would be, did you take of your time to help bring others up? And, one of the key tenets of leadership that we ascribe to is you need to start filling the position that you want to grow into before you are given that title, right? In the 5 levels of leadership, that's one of the concepts that we talk about within the firm. And I think there's so much value to that. Me giving you a new title doesn't change anything other than perhaps external perception. But what you have put into that shows me how good you'll be in that new position.
Well, and as we finish up, I think you've hit on kind of the perfect ending point, which is what you're talking about is that you as a firm owner, as the managing partner, have engaged in a significant amount of transparency when it comes to the expectations, whether it be for career paths or compensations, is that you're very clear on what you are needing to see happen in order for you as the firm owner to fulfill a certain request, whether it be for compensation, promotion, title change. And then it's really up to the individual as managed by their division lead or their director in charge to ensure that growth is occurring before you'll kind of follow through on, yeah, you've checked that box. Let's see how this works out. So that's really it for compensation. Always a difficult conversation. One thing I just wanted to leave everybody with that I think we've got a lot of value out of during this season is that if you have to have a closed door meeting about it to explain it or describe it, it may be too complicated. That making sure that you have written down and are transparent about your expectation is probably the most important thing you can do when it comes to compensation structure. So good luck paying all of your attorneys next year. And that's it for Tapped In. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.